Detail and texture. Hello, I'm Sally Pinhey, botanical artist and ecologist, and this workshop is for people wanting to add habitat information to their illustrations. My inspiration is this mossy oak woodland early on a misty February morning, though other features will be incorporated for the purposes of demonstration. This is the kind of painting you might wish to add habitat information to. These colours are light red, neutral, ultramarine, sap, viridian, cadmium yellow and lemon yellow. The composition is sketched out and some masking is applied together with some underlying washes. The foreground will show detail and the background will show texture. For demonstration purposes, this is a white feather moss or Brachythecium albicans, not necessarily found in this habitat, but suitable to show how to demonstrate its pale tips rising above a tangle of green shapes. Notice the paper, which is handmade. It's heavy duty and not normally used for botanical work, but the rough surface is ideal for some of the texture features, and the heavily sized surface will take the number of washes required to build up tone. As the paper does not need stretching or fixing to a board, it can be moved around under the camera to give you the best view. Having drawn in the shapes of the tips and some of the shapes of the darker pockets, the tone must then be filled in. This must be done fairly dry with a very small brush. A number 1 with a fine point would be perfect. By moving backwards and forwards across the area to be filled in, it's possible to build it up gradually and see how the tones relate to each other. Be careful not to lose the shapes of the tips as you go. This particular moss has its tiny leaves folded close in to each stem. Then, in order for the tips to show pale, dark must be got down behind and then faded away as the bank disappears into the distance and you get a perspective view of the tips. There will be water behind this bank of moss, so it should show up the blurred edge of the moss perfectly. Then, as it fades away into the distance, it just becomes a soft edge. Then it remains to build up the tone, making sure that each little spike of moss starts darker, finishes pale, and shows up nicely against its darker background. So long as your brush has a really fine tip, it doesn't have to be really small. It helps if the belly of the brush holds enough paint for it to flow smoothly without the constant refills that a tiny brush needs. For more information about brush size and quality and pencil grades, and much more besides, find my Botanical Illustrator's Handbook. Published by Crowwood Press at $16.99. So you can put as little or as much of it as you want into an illustration of wild spring flowers, blurring out the edges as you go. In this case, because it's part of a total landscape, it needs to extend across the bottom of the painting, but perhaps I could compromise on the degree of detail towards the edges. Here I'm adding a little bit of masking extra to what is already on the tree trunk, so it goes over the top of an initial wash and isn't completely white. It's a mistake to use your worst brush for masking. You need as good a brush for that as you do for anything else. But you can clean it successfully by first dipping it in washing up liquid before you use it, and that helps to get the masking fluid out of it so that you don't ruin your brush. Little bit of warm water and care immediately will mean that you don't have to sacrifice a brush each time you use it for masking. Having done that, I can now build up some of the tone on the piles of moss. There are many different kinds in here, and each makes its own mound of shape, but with a soft edge which must be maintained, because no mound of moss ever had a hard, smooth edge, however distant it is. In fact, the more distant it is, the more important it is to have your edge soft. So this is water going in here just to blur the edges. Clean water with a soft brush going in immediately onto the paint will keep your edges soft. A size 4 sable brush is perfect for this. As with the moss, I have a sample of vegetation here so that I don't lose the rhythm of the shape of the plant. This is a perfectly ordinary HB pencil. Hopefully you can see the marks it's making. I'm literally just drawing in the shapes that the bracken makes. It may be that this has to be blurred out again eventually anyway, just in case it is too much detail in the middle to far distance. But here you can see now the real texture going in behind as it fills up the distance in the woodland. Some of these tree trunks are ready masked, so I can draw straight across and paint straight across and know that the tree trunk will still come down into the bracken. If you want to recede the tree trunk or the tree, then the thing to do is to take the bracken up further so that it starts further back in the picture. Here you see I've put in a holly tree, a holly bush which I had forgotten, and also, now this is a fan brush, which is such enormous fun. You have to be careful with how you use it or everything ends up looking the same. But there now the number 4 brush is blurring the edges of that so that it can go off into the distance. Bracken is conveniently more or less a light red in colour. If you want to knock it back a bit, then a little bit of ultramarine in there or even a spot of neutral or green will give it a greyer look. You have to be a little bit careful putting anything too red in the background, or it will bring the whole of the background forward and flatten your painting. Here you see most of that band of colour now in, and we will be ready to carry on with the middle ground where there will be more detail. As predicted, I'm having to take out some of the detail in that background area. Now this won't do. We need a lot more water here, and this is a number 20 brush just to get that area wetted, get those nasty scratchy marks out, and then we can start to put in some pigment that can flow away into the water and give us the underlying wash that we need. You see some masking here which won't take the pigment, and that is covering a drawing of a bit of fence post that I've decided to put in to give a little bit of detail in the middle ground there. Now this colour is light red with ultramarine, and never forget that it will dry lighter. Sometimes it looks a bit alarming when you put it straight on the page against white, but it will blur, and in fact sometimes it looks much better when it's wet than it is when it's dry. This is your HB pencil again, putting in some of the detail shapes of the bracken. It will just be a guide so that when I come to put in the darker shapes behind, I don't lose the sense of the brackenness of it. As with any plant that you draw in the distance, it's the external shape which defines what it is. So this is now a lighter wash going in, and this will be the lightest colour of the bracken, and if I can still see the pencil lines when that has dried, then the darker shapes will go into that, drawing a negative essentially to give the shapes of the bracken in there. It will be slightly darker in the foreground, and a few more flashes with your fan brush, just for fun, brings those two areas together a bit. So now we're ready to start putting in some of the shapes behind, or the tone behind the fronds, the dead fronds, and it may turn out to be either a little large or a little bit too much in detail, but you can judge that at the end. If that is the case, then just run it over with a damp brush and that will lose some of the detail. It always seems absolutely tragic to have to do that when you've gone to so much trouble to put the detail in, but sometimes it works out that that's the best way. And the last judgment about how it looks when it's complete is yours to make. Again, you can bring the brackeny shapes and the tone right down behind the masked out fence rail, and that is a great help. You're back here with your number 1 brush, using the detail to build up the tone where you want it. That might actually even turn out to be too much there, even if it dries much lighter, which it will. So we'll give that, there we are, that's a bit better. That also reduces not just the tone but the detail. And then when we get round to it, that mossy bank in the foreground will stand out well against it. So this is the fun bit, taking off the masking, and then we can, when that's peeled off, you can either use your fingernails or a rubber. It comes off quite easily if it hasn't been on too long. What you really don't want to do is leave it on in the sun, when it sort of then will become part of the paper and almost difficult, almost impossible to get off, because it's rubber and it perishes. It's not a product which keeps very well. But drawing in the fence is great fun. This is what it's all building up to. It's just those last little bits that make so much difference. And then you've got the contrast between the light and the dark on the fence, which will take the eye into the middle distance for you. Where it hadn't been masked at all, we can actually extend the fence a little bit with some darker railings, and then move on to some of the foreground, making lovely mossy shapes in the water. We'll lose it when it dries, however. Here we're putting in some underlying colour on the alkaline cliff face. It doesn't sit very convincingly with the acid woodland behind, but it's an opportunity to show algae growing and the wonderful viridian and cobalt mixed colour that you get sometimes on a chalky surface. So it's just going on loosely where the paper had been protected by masking fluid. And then for the green you want something much mossier, and this is an olive green. It's greyer. If you want to make it even greyer, pop in a little bit of your cobalt, which is a very grey blue and lovely for mixing if you want something a little bit distant or less heavy than ultramarine would give you. This is the olive green going on, and while it's wet, it's the best opportunity to get in those fissures, because you want quite a clear line in places and then you want it to fuzz, and where it goes across the damp on the page it will do just that for you. So if you've put it on patchily, you'll get that patchy texture. Great fun. There'll also be pockets of dark in it, and they might just be darker vegetation or holes in the cliff. Doesn't really matter which. Leave it until it's dry before you decide whether it's too dark or not. It's a shame to take it off and then have to strengthen it again later, because the least you touch this, the better. It will look a bit laboured if you have to go on going back into it. This is shadow on the underside of another tuft of moss. Again, your shapes at this juncture need to be fairly indistinct. This is an opportunity to put some of that nice bright orange lichen on this stone here. It is in the middle distance, so it won't need too much detail, but the orange on it will take the eye into the picture from the piece of stone in the foreground. And for this you need a cadmium orange. If you haven't got cadmium orange, then a little bit of cadmium yellow and cadmium red will do just fine. And if you keep the colour really, really dense and the water just damp on the page, then it should make an edge for you as you wish. So this is all a question of controlling run back a bit if you can. Now we can start to fill in quite a lot of the greens on the mossy mound, and again can draw or paint right across that strip in the middle, which is a masked out fallen branch. It's all about wet and dry. If you want a sharp edge, keep it dry. If you want a soft edge, keep it damp. And it's a question of also controlling how much water you've got on your page already. That will change, of course, depending on what temperature you're working in and how fast it dries out. So there's only a lot of playing that can sort out and give you this kind of experience. But in general, if you're working on a really good paper with a strong surface, you get more than one go at it. If it hasn't quite reached your expectations in the first instance. One of the most beautiful things about this view when I first saw it was the way the trees disappeared off into the mist, quite close to. I went back an hour later with my camera and some of it had already gone, but you'll see it helps to give the distance here by the foreground trees actually being visible right to the top and the background trees disappearing before they reach the top of the painting. Here again, working into a wet trunk, I can get the light onto the bark of the silver birch and also some of the markings with the same kind of technique as was used on the crevices on the cliff face. Silver birch bark generally gets more rugged towards the bottom where it's older. A little bit more masking needs to go in here, and again we're back with a better brush, or a good brush anyway. Masking is a clumsy enough tool as it is, without making things more difficult for yourself by using an inappropriate tool. I think you can see the amount of water under the camera on this shot. It picks up the light, so you can actually see the paint flowing into the water, and also, again, a little bit like the fence post, we can now, having taken the masking off that branch, can put in some of the shadow underneath it and get it to trail down, again using it to take the eye round the picture where we want it to be, suitably elegantly, we hope. The branch will also have quite a lot of little growths on it that at this distance will look like little patches of dark. Now we need a little bit more texture on the rock surfaces here, and so a sideways wriggle of the brush, a slightly larger brush, this is a 2, slightly sideways so that it brushes across the surface, the rough surface of the page, and gives you a bristly sort of stroke. A slightly stronger, less watery mix of your lovely aquamarine colour will do fine for this. And then more algae on the surface, and this is also the background for the grasses where you've masked out the lighter ones, which means we can get the real dark, or the pockets of dark behind a clump of grass in without too much trouble there. So we're looking for a little bit more detail here. We're coming more into the foreground, and this clump of grass must really look like one. But again, it needs a soft edge to the tone underneath the blades. And it doesn't do any harm to have a little bit more light red now as we're coming forward. You see the lichen on the rock has dried lighter, and that might need strengthening up again shortly. And now putting in the dark behind the grass. If your strokes of masking are too fat and clumsy, you can at this point fine them down or divide them so that they don't look too colossal and cumbersome. And it's a good idea to look at your grass, decide what kind it is here, and actually get that so that it is a genuine grass and not just a generic icon of one. In many a pond you would have most of this reflected in the water, but as it's a misty day and the painting is already very full, I don't think we need that on this occasion. And the clay pond between the foreground and the middle ground can just sit quietly with just the faintest suggestion of reflection in it. It will, however, need to look like water and have the correct kind of tone and a good join with the land on the far side, which means pockets of tone where you need them and the paint flowing down into the body of water. To wet it very quickly, that was a 20 brush, and again to get that instant flow of tone into the water, it needs a brush that holds a lot of pigment and water as it goes. There will be a lot of green reflected into it. That very bright spot you can see is just water picking up on the camera, and the rest will flow, and obviously again dry lighter. Be a little bit careful that your line where the water meets the land isn't too straight and dark, but if you can get some dark down behind the rock to show it up nicely, but again not lose the edge of the foreground moss, then that would be a good outcome. So that's a bit of a line going in. I'm not sure if that's a good one or not. I might have to put in a few little extra pockets of dark to relieve the straightness of that line. If you've enjoyed this video and you think you would like to do some of this kind of painting, check out sallypinhey.com and some classes ongoing at the Horticultural Correspondence College. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.